Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 40 of IGEL Weekly. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside. I've got Chris, Feeney, and Seb with me. Hey, guys, how's it going?
Good morning.
Good afternoon. Good. Thank you for asking.
So, Chris, I assume you're in the same bucket I am. It's, let's see, it's post-holidays. It's halfway through January. It's sales kickoff season. The Citrix kickoff is going on starting right now. I feel like the whole month of January, we have weather related issues here in the Southeast from time to time, or often in January, February. I just feel like January is just a complete waste as far as work goes. Do you guys feel like
It allows me to get some things like figuring out a new configuration for my home office. Hence, I basically tore everything down and I'm rebuilding from scratch, trying to reinvigorate the mind after a year's worth of whatever setup I had last year. So I threw out the old desk. It's going to the dump. That was long overdue. It was probably like 15-year-old desk anyway, falling apart, but got a new one on sale. Thank you, Office Max, Depot, whatever you call it these days. But yeah, definitely. I don't know about you. I came home from Nashville, and a couple of days later, was like, what is going on? So I spent the weekend kind of fighting off the demons, if you know what I mean. So
yeah, I think a lot of people, and that's another thing this time of year, whether it's COVID or the flu or cold or whatever, you go and you have all these people inside for hours and hours and hours at a time, and everybody comes home sick. January is, I look forward to the reboot, but at the same time, I feel like January just flies by, and as far as accomplishing the goals, nothing gets accomplished.
Yeah, exactly. I think, and then just having to recover. I think part of it is, everything can't be COVID necessarily, but I think also not being around and out and about so much, our immune system may not be completely what it was, perhaps. We'll see.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm living today, woke up breathing, got outside, fresh air. Excited about today's topic.
Just January every year. Seb, how about for you? I know every time I talk to you, you're in that room there, or one of your rooms, or the car, a couple times in the car. Do you get exposed to all the madness that's January in IT, or do you get to just plow ahead and get your job done?
No, it was, I must say, the first week of January was pretty calm. It was a little bit too calm from time to time. So it was really scary because you just got some messages, one or two emails sometimes per day, which is a little bit surprising. But then on the 10th of January, then I would say everything went back to normal. We saw that people are coming back from holidays, and then the normal, let's say, community stress started again, which was good because, doing some lab fixing and trying to update every system is great, but then I need something challenging, and then the customer hit it in. And I must say, we had a few challenges at the beginning of January regarding Citrix Cloud issues. I mean, we were all on the same boat at that moment. So it was a tough topic, I must say. But now it's getting, I must say, quite normal. Calls are coming back, people are coming back, so it feels quite normal.
Yeah, we'll just call it January.
Yeah,
January every year, just same kind of thing. And then you wake up at the end of January and go, oh, I didn't get a lot done. February, I better get a lot more done. And then February is a short month. Next thing you know, it's March, but it all seems to work out in the long run.
Agreed.
Well, Seb, you just hit on a great topic, and I don't know how we would do it. These podcasts already take most of the hour that we have to do this every week. But if we had an opportunity on the community, we do a corporate blog and then a community blog every other week. On the corporate blog recording, if we just said, hey, what's the top 5 things that are happening in the community that need to be addressed? Ooh, that would be good. Maybe we'll figure out a way to work that in at some point.
Yeah.
Or you could put out a poll and just say, hey, there's a topic you'd love to hear us talk about. I'd be all in on that. So,
well, that's a given, right? If people want to, through the community, talk to us, or through LinkedIn or whatever, tell us topics. I think Seb does it, but I'm talking about specifically. I think Chris, you were talking about too. Like, what's the hottest? What was, if you monitored the community last week, what was the hottest 3 things that were being talked about? Let's jump in and talk about those, verbally.
Oh yeah.
That would be awesome. But Well, we picked a topic for today, which, going back to all the madness of January. Okay, so 5 years ago, the January thing was even harder because you didn't get any work done, and you felt like you were stuck in the old ways of doing work. Now, there's icy outside my door today. I'm just sitting here in the home office or in the kitchen at the kitchen table, getting work done. I've been on calls, I've been doing emails, I've been jumping into workspaces, I've been into my CRM, I've been all over the place this morning, and that's just normal, right? That's work hybrid normal, and that fits really well with January. Our topic for today is something that's part of that work normal hybrid world. And I don't know a ton about it. It's popped up in my world several times. And that is the IGEL Shared Workspace concept. And that's what we're going to cover, Seb and team's latest video, walking through that solution. But before we do that, Chris, IGEL Shared Workspace. What is it?
So it's a licensed feature we've had in the product probably close to 10 years. And basically, in a nutshell, it's a feature that's honestly pretty robust, but at the end of the day, it allows you to take a profile that you normally assign to a computer or device, and you can create it and assign it to a user. That's one particular feature that we'll cover here today. And so, and then from there kind of spawns different use cases. It was a separately licensed product in OS 10 days and older. Now it's part of OS 11 in the enterprise management pack add-on option. So if you've not had that license before, then you may not have seen it, but once it's there, you can enable it, and then we'll explore a little bit some of the use cases around it. So obviously one of the bigger things is how do you know how to assign a profile to a user? And so we'll get into that here in just a few minutes.
Yeah, I know it's popped up in my world a couple times. Seb, your definition, your explanation of what this thing is?
Just what Chris said. No, I would just add maybe one or two things, but yeah, that's exactly right. Basically, if you are using IGEL since a couple of years, you are knowing that assigning a profile hit the device. So let's imagine that myself is roaming between 2 or 3 different devices during the day. And let's imagine now that I have some disease in vision, or maybe I'm just left-handed and I want to keep my left-handed mouse over all my devices. That's something which causes usually a little bit of trouble, because obviously you can do the configuration locally in a quick setting. You can push a profile to every new device every time, but it's not handy. And that's the reason why, or it's one of the reasons why we launched the shared workspace feature. Chris is right, I guess more than 10 years maybe, just to cover the fact that we're not able to assign a profile to a device anymore only, but also to an Active Directory account. And that's something which makes you even more flexible. And if you're already using the Azure Cloud Gateway, like an example, you are already holding a valid EMP license subscription. So why not using that feature if it's already there? You do not have to pay any more fees, something like that is included into your EMP. Mm-hmm. And that's something which is what you're already marking in the Zoom session, that you have to check the licenses first. And that's just a small piece of information, but I'm always trying to say to the customer that you have different approaches. You have your IGEL licensing portal, etc. But the easiest way is just to opening up your UMS web app, and go to the license information and check if you have a valid enterprise management pack. It's about, I guess it was unit 3 or 240. And that's, so the definition that Chris gave is 100% correct. I would just add then a second piece, which we will cover a bit later on. The shared workspace won even more importance, in my opinion, last year during the first work from home phase, where we were all hit by the pandemic and where people needed to work from home in a secure way. So obviously Azure OS is already secure, no question, but if you're sending out an UD Pocket to someone in the home office and the UD Pocket got stolen, yeah, basically he could theoretically access the pre-configured information on the device. Or if the UD Pocket gets lost after the pre-initial configuration to ICG, you might still have, let's say, an icon or a background picture from your company.
Yeah.
So coming back now to the main topic, if you're using Shared Workspace and you are using ICG, you will be able to do an extreme powerful process by connecting into your Active Directory without a VPN. But that's something we'll cover in a couple of minutes, I guess.
Yeah, so just to sum it up, and I'm agreeing to this, even though what you're saying now is starting to align with a couple of scenarios that my company has been involved in personally. I mean, our personal needs, when we shifted our workforce to be completely remote during the pandemic, and that is a user-centric approach to how you manage the IGEL configurations, aka profiles. User-centric, that's what this is all about, really, right?
Yeah, totally.
That's great. All right, so I know we want to talk through, I've got a question around the Active Directory piece and maybe Azure AD, but you do a good job in the video. It looks like up until the 3 minutes and 30-second mark, you're actually talking about shared workspace and basically recapping what we're talking about here and how it applies. So if you're listening at some point, maybe go watch the video associated with this one. Let me give you the title of the blog, which is really a recap of the video: How to Use Shared Workspace on IGEL OS Video. So if you were looking for that, go Google it. And Seb, let's jump in now to the 3:30 mark, where you talk about what it does technically first, which is the license check piece.
Exactly. I just have to say one more thing, and I must apologize for everyone who is watching the video. The introduction I made was from the post-processing of the video, absolutely creepy. So I will re-record the introduction. The rest of the video is okay. But the introduction, I don't know, microphone, too much CPU load on my PC during the processing, I don't know. So just in case, the introduction will be re-recorded afterwards. Okay. So on the licensing topic, we already covered it more or less in the pre-discussion. The EMP subscription is mandatory for using the Shared Workspace feature on OS 11. One thing which is important, because the licensing is one piece, but I don't know, since UMS 508 or 507, we are also able to disable that feature in general in the UMS, just because you don't need it, you just don't want to see it in your list. So in that case, we have under UMS administration a specific part which is called features, where you can disable, let's say, the appearance of specific features inside of your UMS console. So if you don't see that, even if you have an EMP, just check that one under features if you maybe have disabled the feature, which might.
Seb, you might have said what the acronym stands for: Enterprise Management Pack, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So in the world of IGEL, you have two licenses. One, the workspace license, and then if you want features like this, then you bolt on to that license the Enterprise Management Pack. Is that the two?
Yeah, that's exactly right. In that EMP, you have a couple of features which are included by default. So the IGEL Cloud Gateway is the most common and the most non-feature, I would say. Then you have the Shared Workspace, the SWP. And then we have a piece that I do not want even to mention, but it's still there. It's called AAT and UMA. So the AAT, so just in case someone is interested in that feature, is giving you the ability to check and to track USB devices connected to your endpoint from your UMS. So let's imagine you have a USB webcam and you want to see how often the user is plugging it off or when it was removed from the device. That's also part of the EMP. And the UMA is a unified management agent, which can be installed on Windows PCs, but let's just skip that topic because it's a nightmare in my opinion.
Okay. All right. So after checking to see that there's an EMP license, the next step is for us, or making sure you have an EMP license in the system. Yeah. Now, let me ask this. So I'm going to say it the way I want it to come out, but I'm going to clarify it. So in the world of IGEL, this is when you tie the device into the license, the workspace and the EMP license, but you're really not tying in the device, you're tying in the operating system running on that device into your world. Because everything IGEL is really software. It just happens to be running on a repurposed device or an IGEL issued device, but it's really that software that's coming in and checking in to make sure a license it needs is there, right?
Yeah, basically it's a unit ID which we're using for that kind of process, but yes, exactly.
We had our sales kickoff last week with Chris and I think another presentation as well. And I'm trying to train my company to say thin client hardware, thin client software, and actually have to add that word to the end of it so that you know that they know what they're talking about and the person listening knows what they're talking about, because based on what IGEL's done, you've really separated the OS from the hardware. And if you just use the word thin client, you know, which one are you talking about? So thin client OS, thin client hardware, put the two together. Now you've got, you know, the solution, but making sure that everybody calls out the OS, which is really the smart part of the whole scenario.
And I
We're
just
even
wanted
trying.
I just want to make a point. I forgot to mention this earlier, Andy, because we talked about this like a year ago. I'm running this literally from an IGEL UD Pocket connected to Zoom, running locally on my IGEL, and I've got a nice little EPOS speakerphone here that I think you were testing out last week. I hope it worked well for your meeting, but
It worked great.
I am eating the dog food right now. It tastes pretty good. So keep going there, Seb.
It's
okay. Seb, I got a question on the Active Directory thing. So as XenTegra, we use Active Directory. We also use Azure AD. By default, Azure AD is our well, first of all, Active Directory is the one and only directory system that this thing plugs into, or are there others that it also can leverage?
No, basically you can also use LDAP, which is also kind of a directory listing, directory user management tool, but we are mostly connecting, I mean, at least from the customer base I'm looking at Active Directory, right?
Okay, so but your comment is you can use LDAP, and Active Directory is just Microsoft's version of LDAP.
Absolutely.
Or, yeah, lightweight directory access protocol.
Yeah.
Okay, so Azure, excuse me, Active Directory on premises, and I'm highlighting the word on premises. I was set through so many presentations last week where they say on-prem or on-prem, yeah.
On premise.
On premise.
No,
that's not the right word. On premises. I'm trying to beat that in my own head. On premises. So Active Directory on premises. What about Azure AD native? Is that something that currently exists, is coming, or will you have to kill me if you tell me?
No, to be honest, I have asked exactly the same question because we had 3 discussions starting up from the community. So I didn't got a really clear answer until now from PM, just because I didn't have the chance to speak with them. We will have an XCon on Thursday. So honestly, before saying something we're not absolutely sure if it's true or not, I would say let's push that to the next podcast maybe. I don't know, Chris, if you got any kind of other feedback, but at the moment I just got it might work, but we can't say it's supported.
Yeah, I remember, Andy, I met with your guys as we were looking into this. It escapes my memory as far as maybe what configuration options with AD, hybrid, native, whatever it is, but definitely get back. I would imagine as we move into our next major version, OS 12, that will probably come up as a primary requirement or added on after it goes out the door sometime this year. So.
Well, it just makes it easier, right? That's the world everybody's moving to. Some brand new companies don't have Active Directory at all. Yeah. It's all Azure AD.
Yeah. Or if everything UMS, ICGs, everything is in Azure already. I know mine is. I just haven't really set up an Azure AD kind of configuration yet. But you know, this is a good time of year to probably mess around with that since it's January kickoff season.
So Seb, I'm going back to the video here. You are under the UMS administration section of UMS of the console, and you're over in the Active Directory LDAP section. And you just want to walk us through what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So what I would mention here is that the Active Directory login here is not to be confused by the local Active Directory profile that you might have configured. And we already talked into the Active Directory login a couple of weeks ago in the podcast. So just look at that specific feature where you connect to UMS server with your Active Directory. We are not speaking about endpoint and your Active Directory at the moment, but only from the UMS. So first of all, we need for the shared workspace, but you might already have done that specific step if your users who are using the UMS console, so your administrators, your service desk, your first level, second level, wanted to log in with the Active Directory credential into the UMS console or UMS web app. That's exactly the step you will do also here. So you're just connecting your UMS server with your LDAP and or your Active Directory and see if you could log in with your server account or whatever account you want to read the Active Directory. So here it's just really a connection. You're not writing something back into the Active Directory, you're just reading from it, reading the groups, the users. If you want to import them into the Active Directory, to the UMS console, that's another topic. But for the moment, for the shared workspace, it's mandatory because if you want to assign a profile to an Active Directory user, you obviously need a connection between both worlds. And that's exactly what you're doing here. So you need a domain name. If your DNS is set up properly, you just click resolve. You should then get a list of domain controllers. Might be dead, just remove them, leave it there, but I would prefer to remove them. And then enter a username and a password that is allowed to read your Active Directory. I use an administrator account, which is not recommended at all, but you could use whatever account you like to read from it.
So,
Well,
Seb, is this a service? Seb, would this be a service account, or you can feel comfortable using your admin credentials to make this connection?
Whatever you like, basically.
Okay.
Both
so real quick, my impression is to be a service account, and this should be something you set up in general because you want users logging in with their AD credentials into UMS anyway, right? Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say a couple of things. This goes back to my days before IGEL. The best practices whenever we're connecting into LDAP. Their option is here in the video, use LDAP S connection, which is right now the default is port 389, which is a regular LDAP, but pretty much all Active Directories are probably going to be set up with an SSL setup. So that would be a best practice for sure. Set that up, import the certificate so you can contact the domain controller or the root. If you click on resolve there, for example, it'll presumably list all the domain controllers that can be reached. We found that a best practice was bring in the root CA that signs all the certs for the domain controllers. That way, if a certain domain controller certificate gets renewed and hasn't been rebooted yet, you can still talk to some other server as well. So that would be a good best practice. And then a service account as well. I don't think it needs very special privileges like administrator wise. I mean, just any account should be able to read and import. I would say maybe authenticated users, but that's generally going to be the case anyway. So, but yeah, set that up and you're good to go.
And Chris, you said read and import. I just to validate, it just goes out and through LDAP, the ability to read the Active Directory and.
Exactly. Yeah, and then from there you have a list of OUs and groups and things, which we'll use later on in this conversation.
So Seb, anything else to highlight in the Active Directory configuration portion of the video?
Basically, no. It's more than enough to check if the connection is working by clicking test connection and then pressing OK, because then you have stored your connection and you're good to go, to be honest. The only thing that is now coming back to the topic of the beginning, just keep in mind that you might have to check the UMS features under your UMS administration path and check if you might have in former times disabled the shared workplace feature, just in case. I mean, I don't know many people who are deactivating that, but you might have done that by your advanced services consultant. So just in case, check that if it's enabled. Then,
hey, can I point something out real quick?
Sure.
This whole thing just made sense to me, and here's why. Everybody I've ever spoke to, I think, has called this shared workspace, which if you work in the Citrix, the Microsoft, the Google, the VMware world that I live in, Okta, workspace means something, right? It means this place where you go and get all your apps and all this data in all one place. Now I notice as we're going through and I'm looking at the video and actually maybe going back to, the title of the blog versus the box that you check are two different words.
Good point. I may have done an error there, to be
Well, and
honest.
that's okay. Everybody I've ever spoken to, including my own employees, has called this thing shared
That's true.
workspace. And my very analytical brain is trying to understand how IGEL shared workspace compares to a Citrix shared workspace or VMware shared workspace. And then all of a sudden, as I see the checkbox in the console, it says workplace, not space. And it totally makes sense to me now.
Yeah.
This is a shared
Absolutely right. A
workplace,
shame.
not workspace.
It's a real shame. Sorry for that. I guess I was just writing the title and just went through exactly the same mindset as you are doing right now, and just said, okay, yep. So
Well, we
that's
have been, so we just had our sales kickoff last week, and I literally stood
Mhm.
in front of my entire team and asked them to tell me what a shared, what digital workspace is. And you know, they kind of got it, but they really weren't solid as to what a shared workspace was, the way I want everybody to think about it. I mean, I literally just think about all the time. What is a workspace in today's terms? Is it a virtual desktop? Could be. Or is it it's a landing page where everything is right there, including actions and data and what, you know, Citrix and VMware, they want you to think of it as. And then what this is really a shared workplace where the device that we're accessing from has lots of ability to be shared amongst users. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's a great point. I think when it was originally, like I said, probably been around 10 years now, you know, this workspace that we're used to these days I don't even think that was really being used 10 years ago, but the idea that a device could be shared amongst different people as they come and go into and out of the office or other scenarios where that device isn't assigned directly to them, that makes complete sense in terms of the name of the feature. Yeah. But yeah, I will neither confirm nor deny that I have used workspace when talking about this feature versus place. So yeah, hits all of us. But yeah, it's shared workplace. And now we'll dig into what you can do with this workplace feature.
Right. So basically what we have there is, if you go back to your main UMS console where you're managing your endpoints, you're having a specific feature, which is with a blue man, a blue icon in front of it, which is called Shared Workplace Users. And where you have then, just beneath it, your domain, where you can then search for a specific account, for a specific group. So what I was doing in the tutorial, I was searching for some demo accounts that I created for my Citrix demo. So I was just going into the domain, then went into users. Since my Active Directory is not that big, I just went directly to the user I want to use and I want to configure.
Hey, let's
So
talk about something real quick, because this came up in my world. We're not joining devices to Active Directory. We're just now looking through Active Directory for users that we can attach actions to.
Exactly. Even on that specific topic, we have a small difference between the Active Directory logging from the endpoint, where we already covered it a couple of weeks ago, where you have to create a profile to make an Active Directory login and having domain controllers deployed to your endpoint, that profile. I just will mention it in a couple of seconds, but it's something that you do not need anymore if you're using Shared Workspace, because I'm already telling you a little bit more about that because it fits exactly in the discussion. The Shared Workspace is working in such a way that the device is not talking to the Active Directory anymore, to your domain controls, like an example, but it's talking to the UMS, and the UMS is talking to your Active Directory.
Now, so you're talking to the UMS by proxy, most likely of the ICG. And in this case, it's a scenario where the device doesn't have the network path to get to the Active Directory anyway. And so it's really the only way around, the only way to get there.
Correct.
Yeah. And that's the reason why, and that's something which we'll cover, like I said, in a couple of seconds. You might have a feature where you can use that, you can use your Active Directory credentials even without VPN. And that's exactly what is the biggest difference between the two worlds. So basically, you can say the shared workspace is exactly the same like logging in into the Active Directory. Why should I need an EMP for that? Yeah, the difference is that if you log into the Active Directory, standardly, you would not be able to assign a profile to that user. That's something that you do in the shared workspace. And that's what we are doing then in the next step, where we have selected a user, and I'm assigning by using the plus button of the assigned objects or drag and drop or whatever way you prefer to assign a profile to an object in the UMS to deploy a configuration. Now there is a specific web page that I showed in the tutorial before even going further, because obviously you cannot assign any kind of settings to a user because it just doesn't make sense. And that's just a web page that I shared which kind of device specific parameters you cannot deploy. I mean, a touchscreen configuration, the update settings, security settings. So if you want to use a local administrator password, like an example, if you want to move the device from one UMS to another by deploying multiple remote management servers, custom partitions. On that point, I must say, it doesn't make sense from a network load perspective, but from a pure feature set, I would like it to have a user-based custom partition rollout, but it's just something that is implemented at the moment. So just telling you that there are some limitations, but for most of the configurations that you're usually deploying to a device, you will not hit exactly that kind of limitations because they are really administratively related. Yeah.
So Seb, we've gone in, we've made sure the shared workplace feature is enabled. Now we're going to create a profile and assign that profile either to a directory or a group of devices. Is that fair?
That's what we did in the past. With the shared workspace, we really do that on an Active Directory domain group or on a specific user. Right. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So you're doing this, so you're going to apply it to a group of users.
Yeah.
How does the device know that it's part of a shared workplace configuration?
That's something that we will cover in a couple of seconds in a profile, because that's something that we didn't went through until now. So we have now assigned the group to that profile, but what we need is to have a profile, which is at minute 7, the security shared workplace profile that enable that feature on the endpoint. So we go basically the same way like we would do on an Active Directory login. So we go to security, we go to login, and then and that's a small difference. We don't do go to Active Directory carriers, but on shared workspace, shared workplace. That's something which will disturb me the rest of the day. And first we have to activate that feature in a profile. So that's activate IGEL Shared Workplace. And if you want to be, let's say, a little bit more flexible, if something goes wrong with your UMS or your Active Directory, I would definitely check the checkbox, which is called skip IGEL Shared Workplace login if UMS server is unavailable. Why that? Our recommendation is, if you want to use Shared Workplace, please use a high availability UMS service. The reason is quite simple. In the standard once UMS server construct, if your UMS goes down, you will not be able to log in on your endpoints anymore, which are using shared workspace. So it's extremely important to understand that your UMS server now is holding a critical, an even more critical role than before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
So
part of the login process. Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, no, there's a couple points there. Obviously, if you've gone into IGEL Academy and had access to some of our advanced certifications, we kind of cover some of these high availability multiple ICGs, and so you're really looking at an N+1 for both your UMS and also ICGs. So multiple ICGs being able to handle users coming in with Share Workplace, multiple UMS servers in case one goes down, for example, another one can pick it up and talk to Active Directory. So just from a design perspective. So, but yeah, I mean, obviously you don't want your users to not be able to get to their machine. So
this is interesting for me because quite often I'm telling people, keep your UMS ICG configuration as basic as possible, make sure you back them up and you can restore them. But all of a sudden you introduce shared workplace and it's in the chain of authentication just to get in and get your job done. That need to have redundancy just went way up the stack in terms of importance.
Yeah, certainly pros and cons when you put some of these additional feature sets together. And I think as we get into some of the use cases for this feature, it'll make more sense as to, hey, does that make is that a good fit for you know, my user's experience that I want, right? Because if all the user is going to do is get into a highly available load balance Citrix session, right? And maybe the Citrix is providing that capability to multiple load balancing, whatever. But if there are features and settings that you want to assign to the user from IGEL, then that's where this feature would maybe come in. And so I think we begin to get into that around 11 minutes in. Is that right? I think that's right on the video.
Yep. Yep.
So yeah, let's maybe you want to talk about a particular profile that would make sense?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm usually doing on a customer demo, or what I did when I was in pre-sales, was just the dump example of a left-handed mouse, which will follow you from one device to another. Just a small piece of configuration, but it just helps to, I would especially say that to avoid that feeling that you're working with a thin client, you're working with a managed endpoint with IGEL OS. And that's something where I just didn't want to interrupt you, Andy. I'm even trying to avoid the terminology thin client in that specific case, because we are deploying configurations like we would do on any kind of standard operating system. And that's something which is covered even more with the shared workspace feature, because there's a user has really the feeling. I mean, you could theoretically also think about having a background picture which follows you, which doesn't make sense from a network perspective, but hey, that's something we might also face in the near future. So
this is all about making everybody feel like they're part of a system that understands them.
Yeah. And not restricting them only, because that's the feeling that a lot of users are getting if they're looking at the thin client. They had a full-blown PC, they were more or less their own admins, and now they get a thin client device, which is limited, has not so much connectivity sometimes, and it's just slow and laggy. No, that's exactly the perspective we do not want to follow.
Hey, quick question for you guys. The main competitors in this space, the ones that make software/hardware that are combined, and even the one other player that does software that I know of, and two other players that do software, do they have this concept where it's user-centric type of experience?
Shared workspace feature, I wouldn't say that, to be honest. The Active Directory login, to be 100% correct, yes, they do, because it's a basic feature and you have to do that. But on user-based configuration, I would just have maybe one in mind who might have that. I mean, we can speak, we are under tech people, it might be Unicorn, to be honest, because I've seen something like that in the past, but I would have to double check, to be honest.
Yeah, okay. This is just more example of IGEL understanding that cookie cutter doesn't get it done these days.
Yeah. I mean, you can beep out the name in the post-production track.
Okay. As if there's any post-production that goes on over here.
That's right. Exactly. Goes straight to the blog site.
I'm sure people love the intro and exit music. It's awesome.
Yes, we need to come up with that. I think it's long overdue. We need some intro and outro. So.
Okay, so Seb, what you're doing here, you're setting up a profile for the user who's logging in through Shared Workplace. The device understands Shared Workplace and it understands, hey, here comes a user. Let's go figure out what's been configured for this user or user in a group or whatever. In this case, you're doing something as simple, which for people who use a left-handed mouse, they're probably frustrated as heck. They probably spent their whole life trying to retrain themselves to use a right-handed mouse because the world doesn't think about them enough.
That's right, exactly. So that's just something we are already a little bit step forward, because I was still at minute 9 or something like that with a profile for the general configuration for the shared workplace. Because if you look at the shared workplace, as soon as you assign the feature, exactly what you are looking at the moment, Andy, the device will show up a light DM greeter, which is a login mask. And that's something which is a little bit disturbing sometimes. The mask itself is exactly the same if you're using Active Directory login without Shared Workspace and Shared Workspace. So sometimes just double check if the Shared Workspace feature is not applying or is not working like expected. Please double check that do not have a profile, maybe a master profile with Active Directory login already assigned. Just a small hint.
Is there any place on the screen where there's a visual, shared workplace is happening here?
That's not the case. It has been asked a couple of times, but the Light EM grid is pretty, how shall I say it, static, and you cannot do that much in that window. So no, for the moment, unfortunately, no. But you can check if the setting of the shared workspace was applied by just checking the local configuration of your endpoint.
Would it make sense maybe to have a different background for your profile that has shared workplace enabled?
Yes, or a different Light EM logo, like an example. But that's something which we might expect in upcoming UMS, but it's not on the high priority list, to be absolutely honest.
Okay, all right.
So what I went through then is to open the Localizer Setup, just to check that the configuration that I assigned to my user really hits the device. So I'm using the IGEL Setup tool, which is in the taskbar, which is showing the actual configuration of the endpoint. And if you go to the user interface input mouse, you see now that there is a profile assigned by having the lock in front of the feature.
The left-handed mouse setting.
Right. So it worked, and it was not assigned to the device. And I'm showing that in a different way by logging into a second account, which is then my Citrix demo account number 2, doing the same step, logging into the device, but then opening the IGEL Setup again, going again to user interface input mouse, and now you see that the left-handed mouse is not assigned anymore, which is the magic that we are trying to achieve, that the configuration is not assigned to the endpoint anymore, but on the user.
So it's like a snowboarder. One guy got off the chairlift, he was regular foot, and the other guy got off goofy foot. Same chairlift.
Yep, exactly. Good explanation for that. Thank you.
Sorry,
So,
it's that time of year.
good.
I'm going snowboarding in a couple of weeks. I went this past weekend.
Lucky you. Oh.
Yeah. Well, you're welcome to come.
Wish I knew how to snowboard.
It's really fun.
It's easy. 4 or 5 sessions, you'll be up and going. No problem.
Really?
Maybe a broken wrist or 2.
That's good on the side patch.
It is a great feeling though, Chris. You should go. I'm going in a couple of weeks. You're welcome to come sleep on the floor. We got plenty of floor space. All right, Seb, going back to the video here.
Yeah.
What are you showing now?
On the next step, we are doing the same stuff with the keyboard layout. So basically, I'm just redoing the same thing with a different assignment where I'm checking from the endpoint. I don't know, just have to shut down my Slack, which is popping up in the background. So what I'm doing is checking the assigned object to that endpoint, because sometimes you will not assign just one profile, but 10, 20, or 30. So you might get the feeling that, hey, I just need an overview about which configuration is now assigned to that user, to that group, to that endpoint. And that's what I'm doing by right-clicking the actual assignment of my configuration. So I'm simulating basically a profile together with an endpoint and how it should then looks like.
So for our Active Directory friends, we're basically doing a resultant set of policies from the UMS.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, just a great comparison. Yes, exactly. That's basically something which is just happening in a read-only mode, because you don't want to change something yet, you just want to check which kind of assignments really hit the device. And that's something that I'm then covering from different perspectives. One last thing that
maybe the most important thing, right? This is all great if you're talking to UMS, but most of our users are going to be out in the wild. How do we get them to talk to UMS from the public internet?
Exactly. So that's something that was not mentioned such often last year during the pandemic, and it was a shame because it might have made the move to the teleworker profiles a little bit easier, because everyone was looking at the ICG, which is a great product for remote managing your endpoints which are not in the company or connected via VPN. But then we have the ability also, as soon as you configured everything like made in the tutorial, that utility worker John Smith working from home is now able to use his John Smith Active Directory account for logging into his UD Pocket or endpoint at home by using the ICG. And there's no change, no configuration needed for that. You just need an ICG. And since you have shared workspace, shared workplace, sorry, you have an ICG already because, I mean, you have the ICG capability done because you have your EMP. So it just common sense to use both of them because it makes the life even easier. Just in case you don't have to assign any profiles to the endpoint for working with that feature. You don't have to assign a left-handed profile just to get it working. No, as soon as you have configured your ICG and configured your shared workplace profile, you're done.
So Seb, I like the way you approach this earlier, right? You started basically talking to UMS, make sure it all works, and then you throw the IGEL Cloud Gateway into the mix and make sure it still works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's basically the end of the magic.
I so much wish we'd recorded this a year ago before I started trying to talk to my team about IGEL Workspace, which I now know is IGEL Workplace, which just the idea of the name itself clarifies for me what it's supposed to be versus yet another workspace that I'm supposed to figure out how to decipher and put into my environment.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we should have done already before, also from our perspective, but hey, we are still learning.
Yeah, yeah, it's an evolution that never will end, not in our lifetime, even well, not in our lifetime. It'll keep going. And options like this and how it applies to a remote teleworking environment, as well as an internal work environment where people want to feel like their thin client operating system, therefore their thin client device knows who they are and treats them like they are who they are. That's important.
Absolutely.
Well, we're out of time, and we somehow managed to take what we thought would be a 15-minute conversation and make almost an hour out of it. So
yeah, certainly, if the folks listening have played around with this feature or have other use cases that we haven't touched on where you found it, certainly would love to hear from y'all either in the community in Slack or after this gets posted up. Just sound off in whatever platform that you're listening on. So love to get your feedback on it.
Yeah, this was extremely helpful for me, just like it is every week, and for the folks listening to now or down the road later when they start going through these. This is it's just good content and great to talk through this. And Seb, I appreciate you jumping on and being so prepared with the content, with the video and the blog that goes along with this, and then having this dialogue around it to me is extremely helpful. And whether you're listening to the podcast now or later, or the video of the podcast later, just great to have the extra content around the topic.
Cool. Thank you for that. I'm really happy to have this discussion with you both, because even on that, we have still different approaches, and I'm definitely profiting also from the feedback from Chris and from his country, and that's something which I really appreciate.
Yeah. Okay, Chris, anything else before we let you go?
No, I think this is a good one to end on. So I hope the rest of your January goes swimmingly.
I'm gonna just try not to drown. I think that's my theme for January.
Sales training month.
Yeah, sales training and promotions and all the great things that go along with January, and then finally February comes and we get some real work done.
There you go. All right.
Well, Seb, anything else you want to add?
No, we are done. I mean, it's a huge topic, and it's definitely sometimes a complicated topic to explain, but I hope that our listeners will enjoy it.
Yeah. Question for you. Are you going to go back and rename the blog to Workplace, or are you going to leave it at Workspace?
No. I will definitely rename it. And since I have to re-record the intro, I will do some small modification to the titles.
I would use the re-recording and the title as a chance to really call this out, because 90+% of the people I talk to about this feature call it the wrong thing, including my own internal people, and I was confused as heck. And now I understand this is just the ability to like, I was expecting you to get us logged in, and then I was expecting this whole application portfolio to show up because it's a workspace. Now I realize it's just, you know, shared user device is what it really is.
Good summarizing.
All right, guys, thank you. And we'll do it again in a week or so.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, sure.
Have a good day.
With pleasure. Take care, guys.
Chris, you can sing some exit music if you want.
I wish I had it queued up.
Well, you got the guitar, just grab it and play it.
Well, in honor of my grandmother's painting, that was her. She did that like, this may not be in tune, so.
Seth, how long until you go with this?
We'll figure it out later.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Thanks, guys.